In this video, we're going to use Izotope RX Voice De-Noise and Izotope Nectar 2 to help produce a vocal and make it sound much better than it was recorded. So we're going to go from something like this, The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe, where you can hear, "Once upon a midnight dreary while I pondered." As you can hear all of that background noise, we're going to take it from that to this. The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe. Once upon a midnight dreary while I pondered, weak and weary, over many acquaintance. And if you just happen to want to get your James Earl Jones on, we can do that too.
The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe. Once upon a midnight dreary while...
So let's go ahead and get started. All right, so let's go ahead and start out here. The first part of this, we're going to go through RX6 Voice De-Noise. I'm going to show you how that works. And then we'll use Izotope Nectar 2 to really produce this dialogue track. Now, we're going to start with this track right here, which I purposely recorded both of these with an air conditioner on. Okay, now this track here was recorded more appropriately, meaning perhaps you forgot to turn your air conditioner off while you were recording your talent. Perhaps you forgot to turn it, or maybe you couldn't access. Maybe you were in a building where you couldn't, you didn't have the choice to say turn an air conditioner off, but you had to get your talent to say whatever you had to get them to say. As you can see, the noise floor here is our noise is much lower. As you can hear that there. Let me put this on loop. Just right click your play button and choose loop playback. And then whenever we make a selection, here we have our smart tool selected, that will loop for us. So you can hear that. Right. Now if we compare that to this track here, which again, I purposely turned the gain way up on my interface. And then I got way back from the microphone just to point this out, just to really show this off. So that's obviously much louder. All right, so we're going to start with this track just so I can show you how vocal de-noise works. But let's get into, before that, producing a track that might have background noise. We need to, of course, clean that track up first before we start applying our EQ. Although you technically could go ahead and apply EQ before you denoise, I mean, in my opinion anyway, you would not want to be putting, any kind of a compressor on something that isn't denoised first. And I'll show you that right here. Let me just turn off this reverb, the effects, the pitch. Okay, that's good right there. So we have a limiter on, a compressor, EQ, whatnot, and we don't have our denoise on. I'll bypass this first, just so you can hear the track. And I'm just reading from Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven. Not the whole thing, just, this little parts of it here. So I hit play and we'll hear this track just as it was captured with way too much background noise. Air conditioner is on. Let's go ahead and try this. The Raven by Edgar. I'll just compensate there, turn it up a little bit. Once upon a midnight dreary while I pondered, weak and weary. So obviously that's not going to work. And if instead we're like, well, maybe I can just go ahead and EQ and compress this and even try to gate it here if we want. Let's just see what that does. Let me make sure I put this back down to 0. I'm just holding down Alt and clicking our volume to put that down to the default. I hit play again. Air conditioner is on. Let's go ahead and try this. The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe. So obviously the only thing we're doing there by compressing, EQing, and limiting, we're just bringing all that noise up. So that's why you need to denoise first. And even if I tried something like just to gate this off first. So let's just take a section here. Let's go ahead and try this. The Raven. Right. So there's spaces here. Let's go ahead and try this. That's voice, that's a space, that's space. So I just select this part here just to sort of show this off. And we'll try to gate this area off. Let's go ahead and try this. The Raven. Let's go ahead and try this. The Raven. You see? Let's go ahead and try this. The Raven. The background noise is way too high to just gate off, so we need to denoise before we start, applying things like compressors and limiters and things like that. Okay? So let's go ahead and bypass this here. We'll get to more creative stuff here in a minute, but the first thing we need to do is check out RX6 Voice De-Noise, and you can get this with the Izotope RX Elements bundle or the Izotope Music Production bundle 2. I actually have both of them, so I actually have 2 copies of this. Okay, and obviously here in Pro Tools, just go down here to plugin, and you can go to noise reduction, and you can find that in there. Or if you do like I do, and I have category and manufacturer listed, I always just come to Izotope, and they will be right in here. So we're using RX6 Voice De-Noise in mono because this is indeed a mono track. So let's go ahead and learn a little bit about Voice De-Noise. You have a lot of options here. When you open it up, it will be on adaptive mode. We also have optimized for dialogue or music. Basically what this does is if you're singing, you're going to be drawing out what you're saying because you're singing, right? Versus you're singing, okay? So this has to do with the speed at which the denoising is working, okay? So we're gonna choose dialogue, but if you're singing, then you want to choose music, all right? So we're gonna choose dialogue. And we'll start up here with adaptive mode. I'll just hit play.
Air conditioner is on. Let's go ahead and try this. The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe.
Now I'll turn it on.
Once upon a midnight dreary,
You can automatically hear
weak and weary.
the difference that's making. Now, if you look at this curve here with adaptive on, you can see it's adapting to our noise
Air
floor.
conditioner is on.
Let's just move forward here a little bit. Pull this down. We'll just grab this area right here.
Till I scarcely more than muttered. Other friends have flown before. On the morrow he will leave me.
You can see how this is
My hopes
adjusting.
have flown before.
Now, in adaptive mode, we can't come in here and move this around. We can do that in manual mode, which we'll get to in a minute, but I want to show you adaptive mode first. All right, so in adaptive mode, we can still manipulate our threshold and our reduction.
Till I scarcely more than muttered. Other friends have flown before. On the morrow he will leave me.
As you can see, we're adjusting the overall threshold here for our curve.
Till I scarcely more than muttered.
We'll pull
Other
up
friends have flown before.
the noise reduction.
On the morrow he will leave me, as my hopes have flown before. Then the bird said, nevermore.
Now, if you look over here, you can see we're definitely losing some level.
Till I scarcely
right over here.
more than muttered.
We can
Other
adjust for
friends
that,
have flown
which I already
before.
have, actually.
On the morrow he will leave me, as my hopes have flown before. Then
So
the
we can compensate for our reduced output there as well. Now, the one thing you're trying to do whenever you're denoising is you're trying not to ruin, you're trying not to ruin your vocal part. Now, obviously, everything I'm showing you here on this track is completely unusable. I mean, if you had to use this track, I feel sorry for you. I mean, something like this it's absolutely awful to try to denoise something this loud. I'm just trying to show you how RX Voice De-Noise works, and then we'll move on to a more applicable track down here, okay? So let's just stay on this track here.
Till I scarcely more than muttered.
Put my threshold
friends
up.
Have flown before. On the morrow he will leave me, as my hopes have flown before.
You can see how it's losing a lot of the low end in that. It just doesn't sound good.
Till I scarcely
So our
more than
threshold
muttered.
is way
Other
too high.
friends Have flown before.
Reduction is way too high.
Till I scarcely more than muttered. Other friends have flown before. On the morrow he will leave me, as my hopes.
That's about as good as we're going to get here in adaptive mode. But let's go ahead and move on. I want to show you how this works first, of course. So here's our threshold offset, the noise threshold curve, and of course our maximum strength of noise reduction. Like I said, this is always a push and pull sort of thing where you're trying to get your threshold just right to where you're not compromising your audio. Same for your noise reduction here. But let's move on. Now we'll turn off adaptive mode. And now we can come in here and start to manipulate each of these bands here. All right, let's come back here to this part, I guess. We'll just hit play.
While I nodded, nearly napping.
I'll turn this down a little bit.
Tapping, as if someone gently rapped.
So I can come in here now, and I can start adjusting these bands, which I'll do, and I'll stop talking because it's a little confusing for me to talk while this is going on, since I am indeed the one reading the Raven at the same time. So
while I
play
nodded,
there.
nearly napping, suddenly there came a tapping, as if someone.
Hear how that
gently
low end
rapped.
comes through? Now, you may not, depending on what you're listening back on, you may not hear that. If you're listening back on a laptop speaker or PC speakers, a lot of times PC speakers are sort of set up to roll off a certain amount in the low end. Sometimes PC speakers are set up to sound good. They have a reproduction range that would sound good to most people. Same thing for laptop speakers. If you're listening on a phone, you may not hear any of this at all. Now, if you're listening through headphones or studio monitors, you will definitely hear this. All right, so once again, I'm going to go through all these bands and adjust them. So hopefully you can hear the differences. I'm going to boost our output here a bit, and I'm actually going to boost the volume of the track overall so you can really hear this.
While I nodded, nearly napping, suddenly there came a tapping, as if someone gently rapping, at my chamber door. While I nodded, nearly napping, suddenly there came a tapping.
See, as I pull this down,
While I nodded, nearly napping, suddenly.
it's letting much more of that low end rumble through.
While I nodded, nearly napping, suddenly there came a.
And of course, if I go into this band,
While I nodded, nearly napping, suddenly there came a tapping, as if someone gently rapping.
and what we're trying to do is, again, we're compromising between removing the noise and then not ruining the vocal, which, as I mentioned, in this example, you're going to have to ruin the vocal to get this anywhere close to usable.
While I nodded, nearly napping, suddenly there came a tapping, as if
So we
someone
have
gently.
a lot of noise in this range here.
While I nodded, nearly napping, suddenly there came a tapping, as if someone gently rapping.
But as you can see, if I compromise and put this way too high,
While I nodded, nearly napping, suddenly there came a tapping.
we're just losing too much of that area.
While I nodded, nearly napping, suddenly there came a tapping, as if someone gently rapping at my chamber door. While I nodded, nearly napping, suddenly there came a tapping, as if someone gently rapping at my chamber door. While I nodded, nearly napping, suddenly there came.
Okay, so that is your manual mode, where you can really go in there and tune this up. I think this is just noise right here. Let's zoom into that. That's just noise. Okay. So if I bypass, that's what it really sounds like. Turn this back on, you can see we are indeed making a difference. We could come in here and really try to get this out. So we're reducing, we're reducing the noise in this case by quite a bit. But whenever we then go back and actually have a vocal in that,
I scarcely more than muttered. Other friends have flown before.
we've completely destroyed that vocal. So again, this is a push and pull sort of thing that you have to do when it comes to denoising, okay?
I scarcely more than muttered. Other friends have flown before. On the morrow he will leave me. As
So
my
what I'm trying to
hopes
do
have
is just
flown
get this
before. Then the birds said,
somewhat usable.
nevermore.
So
I scarcely
I'll bypass it here.
more than muttered. Other friends have flown before. On the morrow he will leave me, as my hopes have flown before. Then the birds said.
So it's it's helping for sure, even in this really awful example. That's about as good as I would be able to get it there in manual. But the other thing I want to show you is we have this learn function here. So the learn function, you will just choose an area. You want at least a second long of just pure noise. So this is pure noise right here. Play that. It's just pure noise. Bypass so you can hear for real. Okay. So now we'll just click learn here. Now it's turned on, and all we have to do is play back, and you will see some sort of brackets go around this learn button whenever it's done. So I'll just hit play. Just let it keep playing, and there we go. So now we have our noise profile pretty much built. We can keep going. You can see the plugin is on. It's not bypassed. Now as soon as I stop playback, there's our brackets, and now when I play back, there we go. So now we have learned our noise curve here in RX6 Voice De-Noise. So let's go back to the front.
Air conditioner is on. Let's go ahead and try this. The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe. Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered, weak and weary,
Of course, we can
over
still
many acquaintance
adjust
curious
our
volume
threshold.
of forgotten lore. While I nodded, nearly napping, suddenly there came a tapping,
and of course our
as if
reduction.
someone gently rapping at my chamber door.
So there you go. So it's, like I said, this is an extreme example up front here. We're going to move on in just a minute, but I just wanted to show you in this extreme example of what RX6 Voice De-Noise indeed does. So you can definitely hear the difference it's making here.
The Raven
So I'll bypass
by
it.
Edgar Allan Poe. Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered, weak and weary, over many a quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore. While I nodded, nearly.
There we go. So now we have done, I've done pretty much all I could do with this. Now what I would actually do is, because we're losing so much of that low end in this, I'll just grab this part here. I would actually come in here, since we're not in adaptive mode.
I scarcely
I'd
more
probably
than muttered.
pull this
Other
down.
friends have flown before.
I'll pull this area down just a bit, just to get a little bit of that low end through.
I scarcely more than muttered. Other friends have flown before.
Now you can hear that hum that comes in when I do that.
I scarcely more than muttered. Other friends have flown before. On the morrow.
But what I'm going to do is I'm going to use EQ to hopefully compensate for that.
Till I scarcely more than muttered, other friends have flown before. On the morrow he will leave me, as my hopes have flown before. Then the bird said, nevermore. Till I scarcely more than muttered, other friends have...
All right, so that's about as good as I can get this right here, but that is RX Voice De-Noise. Now from there, like I said, you know, you wouldn't actually use this piece of audio. Let me hold Alt and click our volume to get that back to 0. You wouldn't actually use this, but if you were in a pinch and you absolutely had to, you know, this is, you know, the only thing you could get from your talent or from yourself or whatever, and you had to use it, well, we're gonna make do with what we got in this case. So let's go ahead and check this out now. Let's come up here and we'll check that gate again. I still don't think we're gonna be able to gate out properly here. And what we don't want our gate coming on and going off and chopping up our words. So let's go to the gate here in Nectar, Nectar 2, which is, by the way, I just clicked this here to go down to the advanced view there. So we'll play.
Let's go ahead and try this.
I'll just highlight this area here. So you can see where that low level noise is. If I cut that off about there, I still don't think it's going to be enough.
It's on. Let's go ahead and try this. The Raven.
See, that sounds awful.
By Edgar Allan Poe. Once upon a midnight...
So yeah, we're not going to be able to use a gate on this.
It's on. Let's go ahead and try this. The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe.
We'll just leave it really low here. All right, so from here, we already have our EQ on.
Air conditioner is on.
And you can see I'm using a shelf, or not a shelf, but a high pass filter there, which we can change our types here. Using high pass to dial out some more of that low end.
Air conditioner is on. Let's go ahead and try this. The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe.
All right.
Once upon a midnight dreary while I pondered.
Of course, that's way too much mids.
Air conditioner is on. Let's go ahead and try this. The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe.
And the reason I'm pulling down the top end a little bit is because when we're using RX6 and we have this up pretty high, it's really pulling out some of that low end and making the vocal a little bit crispy. So I want to pull out a little bit of that top end. Just my opinion on this. Again, we wouldn't actually use this, but if we had to,
air conditioner is on.
That's what I'd do.
Let's go ahead and try this. The Raven by Edgar.
So I bypass.
Allan Poe.
That's what it sounds like.
Once upon a midnight dreary,
I'll turn it back
while
on.
I pondered, weak and weary, over many a quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore.
That's our limiter.
While I nodded, nearly napping.
Come here to our compressor and really
air conditioner is on.
Compress this up.
Let's go ahead and try this.
More.
The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe. Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered, weak and weary, over many a quaint and curious volume.
We have our De-Esser here, which we'll get to in a minute. On the other one, it's a better explanation in the other one, but if I turn that on with the S's only, you can hear what is cutting out for the S's.
Forgotten lore. While I nodded, nearly napping, suddenly.
And of course, we have a compressor to sort of even out the loud and quiet parts. Of course, the problem with the compressor is we're going to end up compressing everything, even that low level noise. But again, you know, in this case, we don't have much of a choice. We've sort of denoised all we could here.
Air conditioner is on. Let's go ahead and try
this. If I bypass
the Raven,
if I bypass the denoiser, which I'll do here, I'm just going to hold down Control and click it. I'm not even going to open it up. Now you're going to hear what it would sound like without denoising it first.
Air conditioner is on. Let's go ahead and try this. The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe.
And that's what it's on.
Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered, weak and weary, over many a quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore. While I nodded, nearly napping.
So of course it's not perfect, but like I said, this is about the best we can do with this one. All right, and that would be about all I would do. Now, again, because this is so noisy, if I had to use this, I would definitely put some reverb on this.
Air conditioner is on.
Let me actually just grab a different part here.
Till I scarcely more than muttered, other friends have flown before. On the morrow he will leave.
Go to our effects here, and
till I scarcely more than muttered, other friends have flown before.
And we can saturate this. That actually might sound good, which is just adding some harmonics distortion there. Not really distorting it, a lot, but just adding a little bit. of that harmonic excitement, so to speak.
Till I scarcely more than muttered, other friends have flown before. On the morrow he will leave me, as my hopes have flown before. Then the bird said, nevermore.
Okay, so that's not as bad as it was. We're clipping a little bit, so we actually might want to pull our input section down a little bit here. Okay, so if I bypass this again, and I'll just hold down control and we'll just bypass our de-noise plugin. Now we'll just listen to this. I have to actually crank the volume up here, so it's sort of congruent here.
Till I scarcely more than muttered, other friends have flown before.
All right. Then we'll turn them both back on.
Till I scarcely more than muttered, other friends have flown before. On the morrow he will leave me, as my hopes have flown before. Then the bird said, nevermore.
Okay, so we're coming along a little bit.
Till I scarcely.
But like I said, for this, the only option we're going to have is to work with the pitch here. So we'll just turn on our pitch, and our pitch is, of course, first here. All we do is click it to turn it on. Now I'll just pull this in the middle to start with. And you can preserve the format here. You can click preserve or not, and you can adjust that, but we'll have it like this for now. We're going to start with just 0. We can, of course, adjust our speed and, of course, the range. We'll leave it on medium. I think medium is where it's going to start. Go back to the beginning.
Air conditioner is on. Let's go ahead and try this. The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe.
I'm actually going to pull this limiter up a bit because we have too much going out here. Just make sure this is, try that. Okay, let's try this now. We'll go back to our pitch module.
Air conditioner is on. Let's go ahead and try this. The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe.
Now we're going to adjust this.
Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered, weak
and weary, over many acquaintance curious volume of forgotten lore.
Go with this section.
Till I scarcely more than muttered.
You can hear this is not really sounding great because our range really matters here. So we have to set the range of the incoming vocal. Now, because my voice is lower, at least what they're going to categorize as low. Some places, you know, some plugins may categorize it as medium, but for this plugin, it's going to be low. So you'll hear, we'll just really put it back on medium here and you'll hear the difference.
Till I scarcely more than muttered. Other friends have flown before.
Now I'll put it on low and it's going to sound much better.
Till I scarcely more than muttered. Other friends have flown before. On the morrow he will leave me, as my hopes have flown before.
So it's not too bad. We need to adjust our speed a little bit. Try that.
Till I scarcely more than muttered. Other friends have flown before. On the morrow he will leave me, as my hopes have flown before.
Then the bird said,
nevermore.
So it's not horrible. We got a little bit of noise in there. It's actually just because of, I'm recording the screen at the same time here. So the CPU is getting hit pretty hard. You wouldn't have that sort of scratchiness in your pitch shift.
While I nodded, nearly napping, suddenly
there came a tapping.
as if someone gently rapping.
You can, you can do some really crazy stuff with our transpose here.
While I nodded, nearly napping, suddenly there came a tapping, as if someone gently rapping at my chamber door.
So that would be something I would definitely have to do with this one. And like I said, I wouldn't actually use this, but if you had to, that might be what you do. You might want to have to put some delay. Harmony is probably not going to work on that again. Put the effects in there. But this would be about as good as we can get this vocal right here. And then you might want to have some like thunder and stuff underneath it that might help to cover up some of that background noise.
The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe. Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered, weak and weary, over many a quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore. While I nodded, nearly napping, suddenly there came a tap.
Okay, so that is just a real somewhat quick explanation of RX6 and Isotope Nectar 2 on something that's extremely unusable. Again, I would not use this, but if I had to, that's what I would do. And plus, this just really shows sort of the power of RX6. I can bypass both of those and turn this up, and this is muted.
The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe. Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered, weak and weary.
If we just had Nectar.
The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe.
Not good at all. So bring De-Noise back on.
The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe. Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered, weak and weary, over many a quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore. While I nodded, nearly napping, suddenly there came a tapping.
So that, that's about as usable as we can get that. But let's go ahead and move on now. And now we'll actually do this for real on a track that doesn't have nearly as much of that background noise. All right, so let's move on to this track right here. Same thing, Raven by Edgar Allan Poe. Now, of course, in this dialogue here, I was much closer to the microphone and the gain wasn't nearly as high because I was, of course, closer to the microphone. You can see the low level noise here.
The Raven.
Let me make sure this is muted and this is muted and do this again. You can hear how much lower that is. I can even jack it up here. Right. Much lower than this was up here. All right. This track isn't perfect, but I think we can get it to more than usable. Okay. So let's go ahead and just listen to a little bit of it, and then we'll start in here with, of course, our De-Noise first.
The Raven by Edgar.
I'll jack it up here so you can hear that background noise.
Once upon a...
What you're listening for is this sound there. Okay? Again, if you're listening on PC speakers, you might not even hear that at all. But it is definitely there. So just listen for this sound. All right.
By Edgar Allan Poe. Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered, weak and weary, over many a quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore, while I nodded, nearly napping.
All right, you got that?
By Edgar Allan.
All right, let's go ahead and fix this. I already have RX6 Voice De-Noise on here. And let's start with adaptive mode. We'll leave it on bypass for now. And let's just squeeze this down a bit. Let's come to this area.
Ah, distinctly I remember, it was in the bleak December, and each separate dying ember wrought its ghost upon...
Immediately you heard that difference there. So bypass it.
Over many a quaint and curious volume
we'll turn it on.
Of forgotten lore. While I nodded, nearly napping, suddenly there came a tapping, as if someone gently rapping at my chamber door. "'Tis some visitor," I muttered, tapping at my chamber door. Only this.
You can see, how well this has done just by using that adaptive. And we haven't even messed with our threshold or reduction here. Let me go to this part.
Though its answer, little meaning, little relevancy bore. For we cannot help agreeing that no living human being ever yet was blessed with seeing bird above his chamber door, bird or beast upon the sculptured bust above his chamber door with such name.
Again, it's a push-pull relationship here. Even with this much lower sort of low-end noise, we still have to sort of adjust how much noise reduction. So we're not, we don't want to pull too much body out of that vocal, okay? So we'll pull this back down.
Though its answer, little meaning,
which obviously is way too low.
Though its answer, little meaning, little relevancy bore. For we cannot help agreeing that no...
We can see the amount of the input and the output up here too in these gray and white areas.
Though its answer, little meaning, little relevancy bore.
No, that's not bad, but there's still a little too much in there.
Till I scarcely more than muttered, "Other friends have flown before. On the morrow he will leave me, as my hopes have flown before." Then the bird said, "Nevermore."
That's actually not bad. So let me find an area of noise here. We'll zoom way in. It's going to hold down shift and use my scroll wheel on my mouse to scroll back and forth. It's a great tip you have to know. Here in Pro Tools, I'll just highlight this area. Again, we're on loop playback. I'll just play. Let me go to bypass first. And then we'll turn it on. So you can see it's done very, very well. I could live with this amount of low end noise. What you might have to do is Control Shift in new mono track. We'll just create a new mono track. Let me just pull it down here. What you might have to end up doing if you have this amount of noise just to make things consistent is, let me just mark that track, hold down Alt Control, bring that down here, and then you could Control D, 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 D. Obviously you would want much longer, samples of room noise, but that would work in a pinch. And just have this low level noise underneath the entire track so it would all sound consistent.
On the floor, eagerly I wished the morrow. Vainly I had sought to borrow from my books surcreased of sorrow. Sorrow.
Okay, but that's, that's just a different technique. We're not gonna go into that here, but let's go ahead and keep fixing this vocal. So you can see how well RX6 Voice De-Noise has already done. Let me just grab this part.
And the silken, sad, uncertain rustling of each purple curtain thrilled me.
Okay, let's go ahead and try learn mode. Again, for learn mode, we need an area of noise, preferably a second long. This is not exactly a second long, but let's just see what we got. Maybe here. That's just low level noise there. Just grab this area. We'll turn learn on. Let's see what curve we get now. And there we go. Our learn is done, or we can just keep going if we want. Again, this is not ideal because we're looping, but this is just what we're doing here. So play back. You can see it's done pretty well. And of course, we can adjust our threshold and the reduction. Again, it's a push-pull relationship here that we have with denoising. That's about as good as we're going to get it there, I think.
The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe.
So see, we're a little too much.
Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered,
on
weak
the
and weary,
threshold, maybe the
over
reduction.
many a quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore, while I nodded, nearly napping, suddenly there came a tapping, as if someone gently rapping at my chamber.
That's done pretty good. I actually think I can make it better. So we're not in adaptive mode. We did learn mode. Now I'm going to, again, because adaptive mode is not checked, we're going to do manual mode. I'm going to come in here and adjust some of these nodes here. Let me go to a different section here.
Deep into that darkness peering, long I stood there wondering, fearing, doubting, dreaming dreams no mortal ever dared to dream before, but the silence was unbroken, and the stillness gave no token.
See, we're losing a lot of that low end with this way up here.
Deep into that darkness peering, long I stood there wondering.
But if we pull too low,
deep into that darkness peering, long.
Hear that low level noise? That. We can pretty much cut it out there, but it ends up cutting off our vocal too much, our voice.
Doubting, dreaming dreams no mortal ever dared to dream before.
We just have to,
silence was unbroken.
Just sort of have to adjust.
Gave no token, and the only word there spoke was the whispered word, Lenore. Then I whispered, and an echo murmured back the word, Lenore. Merely this, and nothing more.
All right, let's go over here.
Though its answer little meaning, little relevancy bore. For we cannot help agreeing that no living human being ever yet.
So that cuts out more here, but again, listen to what it does to our voice.
Though its answer little meaning, little relevancy bore.
It just sounds too unnatural way up here. Even though it's pulling out more noise, it's also pulling out our voice. So that's sort of the idea I'm trying to get across, that you have to consider, you can't just denoise with just an area of noise. You need to actually hear it on the content, because that noise is through the all of the content. One thing we didn't do on this. Let's go ahead and tune this up. Then we'll go to Nectar for a second. I want to show you something else there. But
though its answer little meaning, little relevancy bore. For we cannot help agreeing that no living human being ever yet was blessed with seeing bird above his chamber door, bird or beast upon the sculptured bust above his chamber door, with such name as Nevermore. But the raven, sitting lonely on the placid bust, spoke only that one word, as if his soul in that one word he did outpour. Nothing farther than he uttered, not a feather than he fluttered, though its answer little meaning, little relevancy bore. For we cannot help till I scarcely more than muttered, other friends have flown before, on the morrow he will leave me, as my hopes have flown before. Then the bird said, Nevermore.
That's not bad. obviously the ideal thing to do. I mean, even in this case here, I had the gain kind of high, and I probably wasn't as close to the microphone as I should be. And obviously I had the air conditioner on pretty high. Like I said, if you're in a place where you can't control the air conditioner, maybe you're outside and you can't control the background noise, you're kind of stuck with what you have. You know, do what you can to reduce the noise on site. So you don't have to spend so much time in something like this. But this is actually relatively quick. You know, I could do this whole track in 5 minutes if I wasn't trying to explain it, you know, as I went along here. But I think we're about at where we need to be here.
And the night's Plutonian shore.
I'll bypass
Leave
it.
no black plume as a token of that lie thy soul.
So again, listen to this noise. Okay, we're bypassed.
Quit the bust above my door.
You hear
Take thy beak from out my heart, and take thy form from off my door. Quoth the raven, nevermore.
So we've actually done a pretty good job here. I actually think I can get it a little better, but I don't want to spend all day on this here. I think you get the idea of how RX Voice De-Noise works. It's actually a really good algorithm. You can see even when we turn this way up, you know, we get it way up there. It's still not completely destroying our dialogue.
And the raven, never flitting, still
This is too
sitting,
high.
Still is sitting on the pallid bust of Pallas just above my chamber door. And the raven, never flitting, still.
You can sort of hear how the voice there is sort of narrowed. It's more heavy on the in that mid range, kind of nasally. Now we can fix that somewhat with Nectar 2 or with any EQ, but we're going to use Nectar 2. But like I said, it's a push and pull sort of thing that we're doing here. We're just trying to get this as good as we can without destroying it.
And the raven, never flitting, still.
I actually like more of this low end in there.
And the raven, never flitting.
The problem is that low end buzz there, that low end hum.
And the raven, never flitting, still is sitting on the pallid bust of Pallas just above my chamber door. And the raven, and his eyes have all the seeming of a demon's that is dreaming, and the lamplight o'er him streaming throws his shadow on the floor, and my soul from out that shadow that lies floating on the floor shall be lifted nevermore.
Okay, so we haven't done too bad there. I think I'm going to kind of leave it there. Although we could try adaptive if you want.
And his eyes have all the seeming of a demon's that is dreaming.
Adaptive is cool.
And the lamplight
because it just keeps adapting. You know what?
And his eyes have all the seeming of a demon's.
I might just stick with adaptive. I would pull this down a little more and let a little bit of that low end through. But I think.
And his eyes have all the seeming of a demon's.
I think this sounds better.
And his eyes have all the seeming of a demon's that is dreaming.
And this does.
And the lamplight o'er him streaming throws his shadow on the floor. And my soul from out.
For this case, let's just go ahead and leave adaptive mode on. All right. So we've done pretty good there. Now, right now I'm going to bypass this. Let's close this. You know, one thing I showed you with the last track was that gate. And let me make sure this is off. Turn this. Let's go to the front here. We'll zoom in. And we have, let's say this area here.
The raven.
But let me go ahead and make sure this compressor's off and the limiter's off.
The Raven by Edgar the Raven.
So all of this is just noise. We may be able to clip that off with the gate. I don't know. I don't think we can, but let's see. Turn off the reverb too. Actually,
The Raven by Edgar the Raven by Edgar.
So we can reduce it if I just grab just the noise. Let me grab a different section here that's a little bit longer for our loop. So we can see the noise right there. And we're cutting it off right now. So maybe about there. Of course, the problem with only gating, if you were to only gate this and not denoise it, you would still have the noise in the vocal part. Okay, that noise is in there. That's what low-level noise is, right? But you could gate off these areas. That's pretty low. You can see on our level over here how low that is. So if we just heard that, let's see what that does.
By Edgar Allan Poe. Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered, weak and weary, over many acquaintance.
See, that's not going to work because there's so much noise
On a midnight dreary, while
in the voice that whenever it, dips down to this area,
Allan Poe.
it just doesn't sound natural.
Allan Poe. Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered, weak and weary,
If we took it way up,
over many acquaintance.
then we're just cutting out our voice there.
Allan Poe.
So again, I think we can actually use the gate in this one. Let's turn this back on because we're pretty happy with this. Again, we're going to leave it on adaptive mode. Personally, I would pull this down a bit to let a little bit more of that low end through, which I'm fine with. Just because, something like this here would be produced and you would have some low level noise under it anyway, something like this. And, of course, the idea of that would be it would cover up that low level noise in here. Not all of it, not the full spectrum, but it would definitely help cover up some of this really low end here. But again, like I said, we'll just leave this on adaptive. Okay. So let's hop back in here. Make sure this is on. And these are muted. Very good. And let's check out our gate now.
By Edgar Allan Poe. Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered, weak and weary, over many.
Okay, so our gate's doing much better now. You can see how much lower that noise is. But I don't want it to sound unnatural. And you may not want a gate either, by the way. That's totally up to you. If you want a bunch of breaths and things like that in there, then I wouldn't gate.
Edgar Allan Poe. Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered, weak and weary, over many a quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore, while I nodded, nearly napping, suddenly there came a tapping, as if someone gently rapping at my chamber door. 'Tis some.
That's not bad right there. I'm good with the gate. I'm going to keep it pretty low. All right. Now we already have de-essing on. Let me turn this up a little bit. And I already showed you de-essing before, but we'll look at it here. It'll should make a little more sense here.
Edgar Allan.
Let's go up
I
here.
nodded, nearly napping.
We hear the S's only. So that's what we're reducing. We can, of course, change the area. Somewhere around here, good for me. If we pull it way up.
Vainly I had sought to borrow from my books surcreased of sorrow for the lost Lenore.
Where we have sorrow.
Surcreased of sorrow.
Okay, so we'll turn the de-esser off there. And let's go ahead and turn the compressor on just so you can really hear it.
Surcreased of sorrow for the lost Lenore.
Hear that those hard S's? Turn that de-esser back on.
Surcreased of sorrow for the
Much better. Much better.
surcreased of sorrow
You hear how hard that is? Turn that back on. I'm actually going to pull this down a little more.
surcreased of sorrow for the lost Lenore.
Much better. All right, let's keep going through this. Now, I've already have an EQ on here. I'm pulling out some of that low end there again with our flat high pass there.
Surcreased of sorrow for the lost Lenore. For the rare and radiant maiden whom the angels named Lenore. Nameless here, forevermore.
This gate is not low
And the
enough.
silken, sad, uncertain rustling of each purple curtain thrilled me.
So because we have this compressor on, we're still, we're compressing everything. So that, of course, means we're compressing what's left of our noise, which is still in there.
Surcreased of sorrow for the lost Lenore. For the rare and radiant maiden.
So see, that's actually a good example. How that cuts out and then comes back on.
Its ghost upon the floor. Eagerly I wished
Actually up here.
for the lost Lenore. For the rare.
Very unnatural. So that's another area where you would want to come in here and put your background noise underneath that if you were going to use this track.
For the lost Lenore.
Which I'd have to unmute it, wouldn't I?
For the lost Lenore. For the rare and radiant maiden whom the angels named Lenore.
Now if I bypass
Nameless here,
our background noise
forevermore.
or our RX6,
And the silken, sad, uncertain rustling of each purple curtain thrilled me, filled me with fantastic terrors never felt before. Deep into that darkness peering, long I stood there wondering, fearing, doubting, dreaming dreams no mortal ever dared to dream before, but the silence was unbroken, and the still.
So we're still doing pretty good. Let's keep moving on here. Yeah, that gate is going to have to be much lower. It's probably not even going to get activated, to be honest with you, but...
Deep into that darkness peering, long I stood there wondering, fearing, doubting, dreaming dreams no mortal ever dared to dream before, but the silence was unbroken, and the stillness.
So I'm trying to get rid of some of that nasally tone, or that boxy tone that we have.
Much I marveled, this ungainly fowl to hear discourse so plainly. Much I marveled, though its answer little meaning, little relevancy bore. For we cannot help agreeing that no living human being ever yet was blessed with seeing bird above his chamber door, bird or beast upon the sculptured bust above his chamber door, with such name as...
I'm doing the same thing here. I'm pulling out some of that high end, some of that upper range, just because it's a little bit crispy there. And we're compressing, so it shouldn't be... And we're pulling all the levels up there.
Though its answer little meaning, little relevancy bore.
Bypass this.
For we cannot help agreeing that no living human being ever yet was blessed with seeing bird above his chamber door, bird or beast upon the sculptured bust above his chamber door, with such name.
All right, so we're not doing too bad. We have saturation on already.
Though its answer little meaning, little relevancy bore. For we cannot help agreeing that no living human being ever yet was blessed with seeing bird above his chamber door, bird or beast upon the sculptured bust above his chamber door, with such name as nevermore. But the raven, sitting lonely on the placid bust, spoke only that one word, as if his soul in that one word he did outpour. Nothing farther than he uttered, not a feather than he fluttered, though its answer little meaning, little relevancy bore.
So now we're getting into getting our levels up there with this limiter, okay?
Till I scarcely more than muttered, other friends have flown before, on the morrow.
I don't want to crush it too much, okay?
Till I scarcely more than muttered, other friends have flown before, on the morrow he will...
So you can see we're getting way too crispy right there. We're really pulling that up. We're looking at our levels up here, even though we might not peak because I pull my margin down a bit here. You can still crush your vocal, and somewhere between it really depends. Minus 15, minus 6, would be okay. Again, it depends on what you want to do there.
Have flown before, then the bird said, nevermore. And the night's Plutonian shore, leave no black plume as a token of that lie thy soul has spoken. Leave my...
Okay, so the reverb is, of course, a choice. You wouldn't have to use this reverb, but we are going to use that. And now, actually what I need to do, I need to put this on 0, our actual track.
And the night's Plutonian shore, leave no black plume as a token of that lie.
You hear that background noise? This is bypass right now.
And the night's Plutonian shore, leave no black plume as a token of that lie thy soul has spoken. Leave my loneliness unbroken, quit the bust above my door. Take thy beak from out my heart, and take thy form from off my door.
I actually like that better. We're going to turn off adaptive mode. I like this. I've set up here a little bit better.
And the night's Plutonian shore, leave no black plume as a token of that lie thy soul has spoken. Leave my loneliness unbroken, quit the bust above my door. Take thy beak from out my heart, and take thy form from off my door. Quoth the raven, nevermore.
I would probably mess around with this compressor a bit more.
Beak from out my... Still is sitting on the pallid bust of Pallas just above my chamber door. And his eyes have all the seeming of a demon's that is dreaming, and the lamplight o'er him streaming throws his shadow on the floor. And my soul from out that shadow that lies floating on the floor shall be lifted nevermore.
But we've definitely produced this much better than it was.
Still is sitting on the pallid bust of Pallas just above my chamber door. And his eyes have all the seeming of a demon's that is dreaming. And the lamplight o'er him streaming throws his shadow on the floor. And my soul from out that shadow that lies floating on the floor shall be lifted nevermore.
All right, now if we had this completely produced, where is my... Just grab this here. Let's pull it down here so I can see it. Something like this poem is often you have creepy music in the background and whatnot. So we have our thunder here. If we play that,
is sitting on the pallid bust of Pallas just above my chamber door. And his eyes have all the seeming of a demon's.
Okay, so let me open up our de-noise, bypass this, and play.
Is sitting on the pallid bust of Pallas just above my chamber door.
And turn it back on.
Is sitting on the pallid bust of Pallas.
You know, that is completely usable now. We can actually use... This is still a more extreme example. If you have something with just a little bit of air conditioner noise in it, you can pull it out no problem using a voice de-noise. You know, I might have computer noise or something, you know, that low end and rumble that's barely in there. And you can use this to clean that up very, very, very easily to get a very clean vocal, okay? But again, here is before our voice de-noise.
Never flitting, still is sitting, still is sitting.
And we'll turn it
on
on.
The pallid bust of Pallas just above my chamber door.
And of course we have Nectar 2 on.
And his eyes have all the seeming of a demon's that is dreaming. And the lamplight o'er him streaming throws his shadow on the floor. And my soul from out that shadow.
And if we bring in our background noise.
Dreaming. And the lamplight o'er him streaming.
And it's not going to work because our vocal is it's just still too noisy.
Demons that is dreaming. And the lamplight o'er him streaming throws his shadow on the floor.
Now it works.
And my soul from out that shadow that lies floating on the floor shall be lifted nevermore.
So that actually works. Once you actually get this in production, you do a whole thing to it, it would definitely work. Even though this track was pretty bad whenever we started. Maybe just bypass both of those. Close this down. I'll pull this up and mute this. And again, this is what it sounded like before we did anything to it.
Eyes have all the seeming of a demon's that is dreaming. And the lamplight o'er him streaming throws his shadow on the floor. And my soul...
All right. Now we'll put this back down to 0 and just hold down control and turn both those on. And now we'll hear it after we produced it here.
Eyes have all the seeming of a demon's that is dreaming.
I mean, it's night and day.
And the lamplight o'er him streaming throws his shadow on the floor. And my soul from out that shadow that lies floating on the floor shall be lifted nevermore.
And of course, once we put that production in there.
Eyes have all the seeming of a demon's that is dreaming. And the lamplight o'er him streaming throws his shadow on the floor. And my soul from out that shadow that lies floating on the floor shall be lifted nevermore.
Then of course I fade that out, of course, right there. And have something else on the end, but we're not going to do that here. All right, so that is RX6 Voice De-Noise and Nectar 2, both from Isotope. Of course, as I mentioned up top, we can do, if you want to get your James Earl Jones on, who he reads this poem very well. He has a much slower pace than I do. I'm much more frantic in my readings of things.
Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered, weak and weary, over many a...
Yeah, it's night and day. There's...
Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered...
even listen to just the focus of the voice right down the middle. It's just much more focused once we have our plugins turned on here.
Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered, weak and weary, over many a quaint and curious...
All right, turn them both back on. Make sure I put my volume back down.
Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered, weak and weary, over many a quaint and curious volume of forgotten.
And by using that EQ here in Nectar 2, we've compensated for a bit of that low end roll off that we had. Even though I'm rolling off some here because we're pulling some of the top end out. One thing I might actually do, one thing I could do, because we weren't really pulling much out there. If I wanted to really accentuate that low end after we've cleaned it, you wouldn't want to do this before you clean the vocal, of course. But since we've cleaned it, we could start emphasizing that low end more.
Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered, weak and weary, over many a quaint and curious volume.
So if I bypass, that's not going to work.
Nodded, nearly napping. Suddenly there came a tapping, as if someone gently rapping at my chamber door.
That's sort of a choice that you would have to make on how you want to do your EQ. I definitely need to pull out some of this low, mid, and mid frequencies, just because it's a little too boxy.
Deep into that darkness peering, long I stood there wondering, fearing, doubting, dreaming dreams no mortal ever dared to dream before. But
it's just a little better with that EQ on, in my opinion there. But we could come in here and compensate a bit, for that low end loss, again, because we've cleaned it up here. And even if I do that, I might actually be able to raise this a little more to pull out a little more of that low end rumble and then compensate in here.
Deep into that darkness peering, long I stood there wondering, fearing.
That's a little much, in my opinion.
Dreaming dreams no mortal ever dared to dream before, but the silence was unbroken, and the stillness gave no token, and the only word there spoke was the whispered word, Lenore. Then I whispered, and an echo murmured back the word, Lenore. Merely this, and nothing more. Deep into that darkness peering, long I stood there wondering, though its answer little meaning, little relevancy bore. For we cannot help agreeing that no living human being ever yet was blessed with seeing bird above his chamber door, bird or beast upon the sculptured bust above his chamber door, with such name as Nevermore. But the raven, sitting lonely on the placid bust, spoke only that one word, as if his soul in that one word he did outpour. Nothing farther than he uttered, not a feather than he fluttered, though its answer little meaning, little relevant.
So, as you can tell, we're just putting finishing touches on it here now. I could pull the reduction up a little bit more just to get this even better, but as you can hear, if I bypass both of these once again,
till I scarcely more than muttered, other friends have flown before, on the morrow he will leave me.
Everything, not only the background noise, but we're compressing this, we're limiting this, everything's much more focused and together once we have both of these turned back on, which they're both on now. So that's pretty much all we need to do there. Now we're going to get into some other stuff that you can do. I'll just show off Nectar 2. A bit more. If you want to do some delay, hey, we can do some delay. It's not going to work here very well, but
till I scarcely more than muttered, our friends have flown before.
You could do that on just some areas.
Nevermore.
You just have it bypass in and out with some automation or something.
O black plume, as a token of that lie thy soul has spoken, leave my loneliness unbroken, quit the bust above my door, take thy beak from out my heart, and take thy form from off my door.
You can hear that. Hear those repeats right here that I have 1.9% in there. If we go,
quoth the raven, quoth nevermore, quoth nevermore.
Put this back in here.
Quoth the raven, quoth nevermore, quoth nevermore. And the
kind of cool, but not going to work here. FX off, so that's, if you want to see harmony, it's not going to work here. We're going to get to pitch in a minute for our James Earl Jones sort of deal there. What do we got here?
And the raven, never flitting, still is sitting.
Let me actually mute that background track.
And the raven, never flitting, still is sitting, still is sitting.
You can do some pretty cool things. This is sort of that auto-tune effect you could get.
And the raven, never flitting, still is sitting, still is sitting.
up, down, unison, so on and so forth. And you can do by the steps here.
And the raven.
You can, of course, turn on more voices if you want. Okay. So down. Those two aren't even on. I'm going to turn those back both off. That's an octave down. Let's just go 3. This is, let's go up. Let's go 6.
And the raven, never flitting, still is sitting on the pallet bust of palace just above my chamber door. And his eyes have all the seeming of a demon's that is dreaming, and the lamplight o'er him streaming throws his...
Turn that one off, actually.
And his eyes have all...
This should be down.
And his eyes have all the seeming of a demon's that is dreaming, and the lamplight o'er him streaming throws his shadow on the floor, and my soul...
This on, turn this on.
And his eyes have all the seeming.
So you can do some really cool things with this here, but...
And his eyes have all the seeming of a demon's that is dreaming, and the lamplight o'er him streaming.
But let's go ahead and move on. We're not going to use harmony on this. Let's move on to our James Earl Jones or Darth Vader effect, whatever you want to think of it, our pitch effect. And this is just like we did last time. Just go ahead and turn it on. And we have, of course, our range, our speed, transpose, our format there. And we can do things like our scale type and whatnot, but since we're not, singing, I'm not going to pay attention to that.
And his eyes have all the seeming of a demon's that is dreaming, and the lamplight o'er him streaming throws his shadow on the floor.
If that's what you wanted to do, you've made this much more, a much more sort of intense poem there, just by transposing your voice down a bit. Instead of me having to get up and read the whole thing like James Earl Jones, I could just come in here and transpose it down.
And his eyes have all the seeming.
So I don't have to go, and his eyes have all the seeming. Although that technically would be better for you to do that. You can come in here and do that if you want. I'm not going to tell you how to produce whatever you have, but you could actually have sections that are lower, sections that are higher, so on and so forth. But again, let's bypass our vocal denoise. Now we'll leave pitch on.
The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe.
So that's not going to work.
Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered, weak and weary, over many a quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore.
Now it's on.
While I nodded, nearly napping.
That's clean,
Suddenly
man.
there came a tapping, as if someone gently rapping at my chamber door. "'Tis some visitor," I muttered, tapping at my chamber door. "Only this, nothing more." Ah, distinctly I remember, it was in the bleak December, and each separate dying ember wrought its ghost upon the floor.
Eagerly I wished
The morrow, vainly, I had sought to borrow.
You can go up
from
if you
my
want.
books surcreased of sorrow for the lost.
Lenore, for the rare and radiant
maiden, whom the angels named Lenore, nameless here, forevermore. And the silken, sad, uncertain rustling of each purple curtain thrilled me, filled me with fantastic terrors never felt before. Deep into that darkness peering, long I stood there wondering, fearing, doubting, dreaming dreams no mortal ever dared to dream before. But the silence was unbroken, and the stillness gave no token, and the only word there spoke was the whispered word, Lenore. Then I whispered, and an echo murmured back the word, Lenore. Merely this, and nothing more.
Now you're going to hear areas here that sort of click off. Again, this isn't the whole poem. I just cut up phrases and whatnot. So whenever you hear it click off,
And nothing more.
like that, you would actually, of course, have these probably closer together, or you'd fade out. And like I said before, you'd have controls that. You'd have your background noise right here underneath this whole thing. If you wanted to use background noise, like I said, of course, the other option, which more than likely you would be using if you were producing something like this, completely producing it, you'd have something like this underneath it,
Angel's name,
or some kind of music,
nameless here, forevermore. And the silken, sad, uncertain rustling of each purple curtain thrilled me, filled me with fantastic terrors never
felt before. Deep into that darkness peering, long I stood there wondering, fearing, doubting, dreaming dreams no mortal ever dared to dream before. But the silence was unbroken, and the stillness gave no token, and the only word there spoke was the whispered word, Lenore. Then I whispered, and an echo murmured back the word, Lenore. Merely this, and nothing more. Much I marveled, this ungainly fowl to hear discourse so plainly, though its answer little meaning, little relevancy bore. For we cannot help agreeing that no living human being ever yet was blessed with seeing bird above his chamber door, bird or beast upon the sculptured bust
above his chamber door with such name as Nevermore. But the raven, sitting lonely on the placid bust, spoke only that one word, as if his soul in that one word he did outpour. Nothing farther than he uttered, not a feather than he fluttered, till I scarcely more than muttered, other friends have flown before, on the morrow he will leave me, as my hopes have flown before. Then the bird said, Nevermore.
You can see how that fills in the gap.
And the night's Plutonian shore, leave no black plume as a token of that.
Of course, this part here where you hear the click, that would, that's just because we're going off. I'd, of course, fade that out.
Nevermore.
It's not perfect, but we fixed that.
And the night's Plutonian shore, leave no black plume as a token of that lie thy soul has spoken. Leave my loneliness unbroken, quit the bust above my door. Take thy beak from out my heart, and take thy form from off my door. Quoth the raven, Nevermore. And the raven, never flitting, still is sitting on the pallid bust of Pallas just above my chamber door. And his eyes have all the seeming of a demon's that is dreaming, and the lamplight o'er him streaming throws his shadow on the floor, and my soul from out that shadow that lies floating on the floor shall be lifted nevermore.
Much better, much better, in my opinion. Of course, the pitch shift is an artistic choice. You know, I kind of like between -2 and -3, but you can go crazy with it if you want.
And his eyes have all the seeming.
All right, so let's go ahead and review what we have done here. Again, we'll start with bypass this. I'll just hit Control and bypass Nectar 2, and we'll just go through what we did.
though its answer little meaning, little relevancy bore. For we cannot help.
Of course, we denoise our track with RX6 Voice De-Noise.
Though its answer little meaning, little relevancy bore. For we cannot help agreeing that no living human being ever yet was blessed with seeing bird above his chamber door, bird or beast upon the sculptured bust above his chamber door, with such name as Nevermore.
Okay, and of course, this video is rather long. I realize that, but in reality, RX6 Voice De-Noise is pretty fast. I mean, you saw how fast it was to sort of go through that learn mode. We turned off, adapted, did learn, and then we sort of manually adjusted. You could do, like I said, you could do this whole track in just a matter of a couple of minutes. Okay, same for setting up Nectar 2 here. It really only took me, because I actually did this before I actually recorded. It took 5, 6, 7 minutes to set everything up to go from, this
was blessed with seeing bird above his chamber
to
door,
this.
Bird or beast upon the sculptured bust above his chamber door, with such name as Nevermore. But the raven, sitting lonely on the placid bust, spoke only that one word, as if his soul in that.
And as I said, the pitch is sort of it's just an artistic choice there. You would be better off if you knew you wanted this.
Was blessed with seeing bird above his chamber door, bird or beast.
You'd be better to perform it that way, bird or beast above his chamber door. It would be better to do that. But if all you can do is sort of, talk up here, bird or beast upon his chamber door, And of course you have that transpose to help you out there. Okay. But yeah, I just wanted to show that off. You know, if I was gonna read this for real, I would you know,
Sculptured bust above his
chamber door with such name.
you know, I'd do it with such name as Nevermore. You know, I'd read it like that instead of you know, at a more frantic pace. But you can see what that pitch does. So we adjusted the pitch. I kind of like minus 1 to -2, I think is enough. You can see on our gate, it's not
door with such name.
it's not really affecting,
Nevermore.
you know, it's not, you know, cutting completely out in these lower areas of noise here. It's just
Or, for we cannot.
it's just pulling that down just, you know, just a bit there. And then of course our de-esser, which we already saw,
Or,
S's only. So it's working pretty hard there.
agreeing that no living human being ever yet was blessed with seeing birth.
Then on our EQ, we're rolling off some of that low end with our high pass. And then sort of this upper low end range, we're pulling in a bit just to compensate for some of the reduced sort of body we get from our denoising here. Okay. Same reason why we're pulling out some of the top end here overall, because if I just bypass the EQ,
Agreeing that no living human being ever yet was blessed with seeing bird above his chamber door. Bird or beast upon the sculptured.
do you hear the difference there? Let me see if I can go to a better part here.
Friends have flown before. On the morrow he will leave me, as my hopes have flown before.
Turn the
Then
pitch
the
off.
bird said, nevermore. Till I scarcely more than muttered, other friends have flown before. On the morrow he will leave me, as my hopes have flown.
Hear that? It's not a huge, you know, it's not a huge difference, but you can definitely tell there's more low end, more body in that. It's not quite as crispy on the top end there. And of course we're compressing everything. We're compressing it obviously after we denoise it. If we compressed it before we denoised it, we're gonna bring all that noise up. Okay, so denoiser is now deactivated.
Friends have flown before. On the morrow he.
See how we're pulling up all that noise?
Friends have flown before. On the morrow he will leave me,
There we
as
go.
my hopes have flown before. Then the bird said, nevermore.
Then we have some saturation just for those harmonic effects, that harmonic distortion. You know, we're not really distorting it. We can distort it down here in the effects area if we want, which I don't want to, but we're really just sort of adding some of those harmonics, some of that nice tape distortion.
Leave no black plume as a token of that lie thy soul has spoken. Leave my loneliness unbroken. Quit the bust above my door.
Take thy beak from out my heart, and take thy form from off my door. Quoth the raven, nevermore.
Okay, and then we have, of course, our reverb. Again, like I said, you don't have to use the reverb here. In Nectar 2, it does pretty well, but it may not always be exactly what you want. We can pre-delay this some if we want to. So pre-delay is just amount of time it takes for the initial reflection of the reverb to occur, so we can have more of that unaffected vocal come through first.
Eyes have all the seeming of a demon's that.
We can really pull the decay up too.
Eyes have all the seeming of a demon's that is dreaming. And the lamplight o'er him streaming throws his shadow on the floor. And my soul.
Of course, the problem with that is you don't want to get a big, build up there. I kind of like a little pre-delay. It doesn't have to be that much.
Eyes have all the seeming of a demon's that is dreaming. And the lamplight o'er him streaming throws his shadow on the floor.
And of course, we are limiting it here. I pulled this down because I don't want it to be on 0. Pull this down just a bit. I don't want to clip.
Eyes have all the seeming of a demon's that is dreaming. And the lamplight o'er him streaming throws his shadow on the floor.
I don't want to.
Eyes have all the seeming of a demon's that is dreaming. And the lamplight o'er him streaming.
I don't want to kill it there. About there's good.
Eyes have all the seeming of a demon's that is dreaming. And the lamplight o'er him streaming.
Throws his shadow on the floor. And my soul from out that shadow that lies floating on the floor shall be lifted nevermore.
Okay, so that's everything we've done to it. We'll go back to the beginning. And I'll just bypass these effects back and forth so you can sort of hear how we've taken this, a track from kind of unusable to more than usable. And we'll turn on our background noise too while we're at it, our thunder and whatnot. So we'll start out bypass with both of these here. Go ahead and hit play here. We'll just go through the whole thing and I'll bypass each of these and turn them on and off and whatnot, okay? The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe. Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered, weak and weary, over many a quaint and curious volume. And the background noise is gone now. While I nodded, nearly napping, suddenly there came a tapping, as if someone gently rapping at my chamber door. "'Tis some visitor," I muttered, tapping at my chamber door. "Only this, nothing more." Ah, distinctly I remember, it was in the bleak December, and each separate dying ember wrought its ghost upon the floor. Eagerly I wished the morrow, vainly I had sought to borrow from my books surceased of sorrow for the lost Lenore, for the rare and radiant maiden whom the angels named Lenore, nameless here forevermore.
And the silken, sad, uncertain rustling of each purple curtain thrilled me, filled me with fantastic terrors never felt before. Deep into that darkness peering, long I stood there wondering, fearing, doubting, dreaming dreams no mortal ever dared to dream before. But the silence was unbroken, and the stillness gave no token, and the only word there spoke was the whispered word, Lenore. Then I whispered, and an echo murmured back the word, Lenore. Merely this, and nothing more. Much I marveled, this ungainly fowl to hear discourse so plainly, though its answer little meaning, little relevancy bore. For we cannot help agreeing that no living human being ever yet was blessed with seeing bird above his chamber door, bird or beast upon the sculptured bust above his chamber door, with such name as Nevermore. But the raven, sitting lonely on the placid bust, spoke only that one word, as if his soul in that one word he did outpour. Nothing farther than he uttered, not a feather than he fluttered, till I scarcely more than muttered, "Other friends have flown before. On the morrow he will leave me, as my hopes have flown before." Then the bird said, "Nevermore."
And the night's Plutonian shore, leave no black plume as a token of that lie thy soul has spoken. Leave
my loneliness unbroken, quit the bust above my door. Take thy beak from out my heart, and take thy form from off my door. Quoth the raven, "Nevermore." And the raven, never flitting, still is sitting on the pallid bust of Pallas just above my chamber door. And his eyes have all the seeming of a demon's that is dreaming, and the lamplight o'er him streaming throws his shadow on the floor. And my soul from out that shadow that lies floating on the floor shall be lifted nevermore.
Very cool. So we've taken that vocal to something that actually sounds pretty good there. Let me go ahead and bypass both of those again. We'll just listen to the last part one more time, and we'll wrap this up. So we can hear all the background noise. We can hear just how unfocused it is. And his eyes have all the seeming of a demon's that is dreaming, and the lamplight o'er him streaming throws his shadow on the floor. All right, turn these both back on and pull that volume down.
And his eyes have all the seeming of a demon.
I mean, it's night and day. We don't even have to have this pitch effect on. We could turn that off if we want.
And his eyes have all the seeming of a demon's that is dreaming, and the lamplight o'er him streaming throws his shadow
on the floor. And my soul from out that shadow that lies floating on the floor shall be lifted nevermore.
And fade that out. Okay, very cool. So that is using RX6 Voice De-Noise to, of course, first denoise our track, and then using Isotope's Nectar 2 to, in our case, we would do a little pitch shifting, gating, de-essing, EQ, compressing, a little saturation, a little bit of reverb, and limiting to really produce that vocal and make a much more professional sound. Both of these plugins, you can get both of these plugins here, and plus a whole lot more like Neutron. Of course, we could use Neutron for this. We could use Ozone 7 for this as well. You can get all of those plugins in one bundle with the Music Production Bundle 2. It's a great investment. It has a lot of mixing tools, correcting tools, so on and so forth as well. And of course, there's the Elements version of RX out there, which I have that too. But as you can see, both of these tools do very well for editing, producing our dialogue track here. Okay, that's pretty much it. I'll give you one last listen here.
Ah, distinctly I remember, it was in the bleak December, and each separate dying ember
wrought its ghost upon the floor. Ah,
come down here. Let's go up here.
Though its answer little meaning, little relevancy bore. For we cannot help agreeing that no living human being ever yet was blessed with seeing bird above his chamber door,
bird or beast upon sculptured bust
above his chamber door, with such name as Nevermore. But the raven, sitting lonely on the placid bust, spoke only that one word, as if his
soul in that one word he did outpour. Nothing farther than he uttered, not a feather than he fluttered, till I scarcely more than muttered, other friends have flown before, on the morrow he will leave me, as my hopes have flown before. Then the bird said, nevermore.
Okay. Of course, both of these plugins work great for voiceovers, as you just saw, voiceovers, dialogue, narration, and of course, for singing. Okay, so that is using RX Voice De-Noise and Izotope Nectar 2 to completely denoise and produce a dialogue track right here in Pro Tools. And of course, these will work in other DAWs as well.